Hello, pumpkins and dumplings. I've had an idea rolling around in my noggin for a little bit about doing a list, just an overarching list of some of my favorite albums to not only give you guys some insight into myself, but to also start a conversation with you guys about your favorite albums. Now, a ground rule, a stipulation I want to set for this is these albums aren't necessarily based around how amazing of musicianship they have. These are all records that just for one reason or another, at the point in my life that I heard them, left such a strong impact on me that emotionally or influentially they have had a massive impact on me as a person, either lyrically, either visually, conceptually, vocally, some form or fashion it influenced me or led me to this point. And here is the fun part about this video. The list that I have compiled, it is not all limited to just metal or rock music. These are going to be albums spanning all across the musical genre landscape, because even though this channel is dedicated primarily to metal, rock, and experimental music, I frequent so many genres and have loved so many albums that I don't think it would be right of me to just limit it to just metal for a list like this. So don't feel afraid to include records from any genre as long as the record means something to you. You don't have to justify it to anyone, you don't have to say why, but I would love to hear what your favorite records are no matter what the genre is. So definitely let me know your list down below as well as your thoughts of this list, but without further ado, I'm going to try to do these gunshot style because I have quite a few records to go through and I don't want to end up making this video too terribly long, so I'm not going to go too terribly in depth with any one of these, but if you want to go check out any of these records, it goes without saying for them being on this list that I heavily suggest checking them out. The first record or records I want to shout out are the records Meteora and Hybrid Theory from Linkin Park. I don't think this is going to come as any surprise. These were massively influential records, not only on myself, but my pretty much entire generation. If you grew up in the 90s or the 2000s, Linkin Park most likely had an influence on your favorite band or favorite bands or yourself. And I know for a fact, vocally, lyrically, conceptually, Linkin Park has had a massive influence on myself, and I will never forget being a kid and having like Meteora and Hybrid Theory on CD, and those records really did change my life. And tracks like In the End and Numb and Crawling are always going to be staples for me when it comes to just classic metal and rock music that shaped me into the person that I am today. Rest in peace to Chester. The record October Rust from Typo Negative pretty much single-handedly got me into more moody and dreary melancholic records and doom and gothic metal. I think that no one has ever been able to match the level of vocal talent for that specific style that Peter did, and this record, when I first heard that track and the chilling keys and his just vampiric voice, it has left an imprint on me forever. And I got that record on CD, and I just can easily go back to that and spin that front to back and it just be as great as the first time I heard it. And in my opinion, with the Typo Negative discography, it's set shoulders above the rest for like my favorite. Probably my favorite post-rock record, period, is the Indie Halder record or Indie Halder record, Enjoy Eternal Bliss. This record takes me to a different place when I listen to it. I am a big fan of atmospheric and ambient music and just post-rock, post-metal, ambient, dark wave, whatever you want to call it. I just adore the atmosphere this record imposes, and it speaks volumes to just so much lackadaisical feelings of hopelessness and desperation, but just like it says, bliss and hope. It's an incredible post-rock record, and it has a reputation for being one of the most famous for a damn good reason. This record is one of those things I can just forget about everything and escape and get transported to another place entirely. My next favorite record is Glenn Check's EP, the Glenn Check Experience EP. Glenn Check is a band I discovered because of someone that was very important in my life, and every time I listen to them, I think of them, and they exposed me to this project that is basically this Korean synthwave and synth pop sort of art pop band that they are very trip hop inspired as well, and one of their hallmarks is they only sing in English. I really like Glenn Check just as a band as a whole, but this EP in particular I think combines so many influences from trip hop and synth music and art music that I can't help but just get enamored with tracks like Follow the White Rabbit and Dreaming Kills. I fucking love this record. I think the vocals are ethereal, and I think this is one of those nostalgic personal picks just because I can listen to this record and just get transported back with that person. Next up, Tomorrow We Die Alive from Born of Osiris. This was one of the first records that I heard that got me into djent, and anyone that follows this channel will know that I am a big fan of like the progressive metalcore and djent movements. And Born of Osiris have always been one of my favorite bands up until this point, and they continue to be one of my favorite bands. And I'm not the biggest fan of some of their later records, and I know a lot of people praise the shit out of the Discovery, and of course that is an amazing record. It gets the praise it gets for a reason. But Tomorrow We Die Alive, when I hear tracks like Divergency and Machine, they bring me back to a time when I was not really being exposed to music that was that extreme, and right around the time it came out, I was following Sumerian Records for some other bands, which I will get to in this list. I was a big fan of Sumerian Records around that time, and when this record came out, I was like, wow, this is insane, this is crazy. And I ended up trying to find it on physical copy at some of the record stores near me, and I couldn't find it. But I did find Soul Sphere, which came out in like 2015, I believe, and that just set me on a path of collecting things from Born of Osiris. I actually have a one of the signed drumsticks from Born of Osiris because I saw them live. Fantastic show, would love to see them again someday. Fantastic record. It pretty much single-handedly got me into like djent and progressive metalcore music, and I would argue that those are my favorite genres now, so thank you Born of Osiris. Or just, I guess, thank you Sumerian Records as a whole. Next up, How to Disappear Completely with Seraphim. This is an ambient record, a dark ambient record, and like I said, I'm a big fan of ambient music. I have an entire playlist on Spotify dedicated to nothing but ambient music, and I could make videos about that. I would love to make some videos on ambient music. I know that kind of goes as like the exact opposite to what you would expect from a metalhead, but I a lot of times have like, I guess, dissociative tendencies or just drifting tendencies, and a lot of times when I listen to ambient music, it transports me to a place where those feelings are sort of affirmed and identifiable, and it just makes me think and helps me fall asleep as well, because I, generally speaking, have trouble falling and staying asleep, and this music has always been something that has helped me. And this record in particular, I just have a lot of memories of specific points in my life where I was either falling asleep or trying to fall asleep, or just listening to it while I write or while I work. And I have a lot to thank for this record. I think it's been my most listened to album just on Spotify throughout the years because of how much I frequently spun this thing. Next up, Killswitch Engage with The End of Heartache. This record was like what showed me what the fuck metalcore could do. I love the Howard Jones era of Killswitch Engage, just like my favorite thing ever, and I very much prefer the era of Killswitch Engage where Howard was the lead vocalist. Just so powerful. It showed the amazing hallmarks that got me into metalcore so much. Just the, in-your feels choruses, but the heavy, all-encompassing verses and breakdowns. I think Killswitch Engage and As I Lay Dying have really been like some of the forefathers that got me into metalcore. And I obviously know that in the 90s there was a lot more metalcore bands, and there's a ton of other forefathers that came before them like Converge and Hatebreed and Ringworm, but generally speaking the 2000s metalcore scene is what I was brought up on, and so I have more of an affinity for nostalgia when it comes to bands like Killswitch and As I Lay Dying and those type of bands. Some others we'll get into as well, but this record just got me into metalcore so much. Next up, Benighted with Asylum Cave. Benighted have been one of my favorite death grind bands on the map, and when I heard this you'll notice a trend with some of these records. This was the first time I was really introduced to death metal being infused with like grindcore. Like, I had listened to death metal around that point, like the classics like Death and Morbid Angel, Obituary, Cannibal Corpse, but I had not been exposed to something so frantic and fast, and I had listened to maybe things like, Pig Destroyer, just generally speaking grindcore, like Napalm Death. Benighted got me into Season of Mist. It showed me how extreme metal could be in this style, and considering death grind nowadays is one of my favorite genres, I really appreciate Benighted, and hearing the combination of like 3 different languages on this record and how pummeling the drums are and the production and the vocals, it's so monstrous and insulated and dense. It just is fantastic to me, and I love it very much. Similarly, Carcass with Reek of Putrefaction. I remember when I was getting into extreme metal, I got really fascinated by the subgenres, and it's one of the reasons that I'm kind of like a fucking living, walking encyclopedia when it comes to subgenres and niches. And I knew Carcass was like a big band because of some of their later works. But then when I saw the term gore grind thrown around, and I was like, Carcass started that? Well, Carcass doesn't really sound like this. And then I went back to Putrefaction, which I talked about, and wow, I think this was another one of those cases of me being introduced to a form of metal that was just so ubiquitous when it came to extremity and intensity and being like avant-garde unintentionally and so innovative and fresh. And nowadays I really enjoy a lot of gore grind bands and death grind bands and grind bands, and to think that Carcass, who are one of the bigger names in like death metal, especially like melodic death metal and technical death metal's later years, it's kind of insane to think that they also kickstarted an entire niche subgenre that a lot of people don't know. It's kind of like talking about how like Bring Me the Horizon was a deathcore band when they first started, but then never again. A lot of people forget about that, especially if you were a fan of them later in their career. And funnily enough, the next band that I'm talking about is Bring Me the Horizon. And I went back and forth in my head of which record to pick. You guys can't see this, but I literally, above like my recording station and like my computer and stuff, there's just a massive Bring Me the Horizon poster. I actually am a big fan of Bring Me the Horizon. They're one of my favorite bands. Fucking fight me on that. And I went back and forth in my head of which record to include, because I have a lot of attachments to Suicide Season as well as Sempiternal, and That's the Spirit. But I ended up going with There Is a Hell, Believe Me, I've Seen It. There Is a Heaven, Let's Keep It a Secret. Every single one of these songs are just classics in my opinion, and it came to me in a time in my life where when I was getting into Bring Me the Horizon, it was the Goldilocks zone of like, they were in this era where like Sempiternal was coming out and That's the Spirit, and they were changing up their style, and I really liked their early material, I really liked their later material, but this record just felt like such an anthemic, victorious, powerfully vulnerable, and raw record. And I understand people praise the hell out of Sempiternal and stuff, but I just adore There Is a Hell. I think it is flawless by Bring Me the Horizon standards, and songs like Anthem and Fuck and It Never Ends, Crucify Me, Alligator Blood, I just can go back to any of those songs and just mosh out and feel captivated by them and go back to the first time I listened to them. And it was one of those first records for me that when I heard, I had to own it on physical copy, and I do. Next up, Dir en Grey with Ouroboros. I think this is Dir en Grey's best record. This is one of the records that got me very much into kind of avant-garde metal as well as visual K metal from like Japan. And this is another one like Glenn Check that came from this one friend that turned me on to Dir en Grey, and he was incredible. Like he turned me on to so much good music from like the overseas like department, and got me into a lot of avant-garde music. And Dir en Grey, Kyo is one of the most insane vocalists in metal, and I would love to do just a video essay or something on Dir en Grey, because you don't get what you get from them from like anyone else. It is actually incredible, and every time I listen to this record, it just leaves me in awe, and I notice things about it that I didn't even notice the first time. It's fantastic. Next up, Sayor with Forgotten Paths. This record is, I believe, the most recent, or one of the most recent. It has to be, I think, the most recent. This record is fucking beautiful. It is my favorite black metal record that is infused with folk music. It's like my favorite black and folk metal record, if you could want to call it that. The orchestration on it, the fact that this is just a solo project, the production, it's crystal clear, it's crisp, and I can't explain how much I adore atmosphere and music. And I hate how a lot of times with black metal that's infused with other things, it gets overpowered by the influence, or the influence overpowers like something else, or maybe the black metal overpowers the influence. Sayor is perfect, and I cannot recommend this project enough if you want to hear black and folk metal done properly, in my opinion. Cattle Decapitation with The Harvest Floor is next. I actually was going to include like Monolith of Inhumanity or the Anthropocene Extinction, but I had to go with The Harvest Floor because this was the first Cattle Decapitation record I heard, and it was recommended to me on like Metal Blade Records because it was a label that I followed, and it got recommended while I was listening to something else, and I was like, holy shit, this name, this logo, this sound, just the artwork, everything about it was insane. And then I looked it up and to find out that they were like a environmentally like conscious band with like green thumbs, and they were like very much like vegan centric, and they just hated humanity in such a way that didn't feel so disingenuous or fake, or I don't know. It felt like it was authentic. Like it didn't feel like they were just fucking around or bullshitting like their approach to it. And Cattle Decap are now one of my favorite bands and have been for many, many years now. And The Harvest Floor is what I have to thank for that. And of course, I love records like Death Atlas and The Anthropocene Extinction and Monolith in Humanity, and even records like To Serve Man. But The Harvest Floor is like that period of time where they were still so raw and so like undefined, but they still had that like mechanical sound to them that I just couldn't get enough of at the time. Alright, y'all are gonna laugh, y'all are gonna like shit down my throat for this, but next up I have to include Stand Up and Scream by Asking Alexandria. You could not get me off of this record when I first got exposed to it, and a lot of people that grew up in my generation and got into like metalcore did. I missed out on a lot of like the emo craze of like the 2000s when it came to like in 2010s. Like I wasn't a fan of like Pierce the Veil, Sleeping with Sirens, Falling in Reverse, Mayday Parade, you know, of Mice and Men, but I was an Asking Alexandria fan. And I just, just Danny Worsnop's vocals were so raw, and Ben Bruce's vocals were so raw. The lyrics were so on the nose and cringy, and what they did for that sort of MySpace metalcore scene, you are still seeing the effects of, and I will stand by that. Asking Alexandria's influence on so many bands that came after them, and the fact that they have been able to change up their style so much. And unfortunately, like, I am not a fan of their recent stuff, and it's not because, oh, I don't like Maturity, or I don't like Evolution, or I want them to go back to being a metalcore band. No, I just think their execution's crappy. Stand Up and Scream has just a level of complete immaturity and just spit to it that you can't really replicate. It's kind of like saying like Kill 'Em All from Metallica. Like it's just that youthful exuberance that just bleeds through. And in general, for like my screams and growls, Danny Worsnop inspired me a ton, and Ben Bruce's singing style and lyrical style, it influenced me a lot. And you can't tell me you don't hear some of those refrains or choruses or breakdowns and your head doesn't bob. Come on. Next up, Clairvoyant by The Contortionist. I was kind of split on including this or Language, but Clairvoyant released right when I got into The Contortionist. I wasn't familiar with them when they dropped Language, and then Clairvoyant came around, and then I listened to that record and then got into their discography, and I ended up getting like Exoplanet and Language and Clairvoyant on CD. I have Clairvoyant signed. This record, beautiful atmosphere, beautiful progressive metal record. Michael Lassard is one of my favorite vocalists in like the post-progressive metal genre, whatever you want to call it. He is so smooth. Lyrics here are beautiful, they are gorgeous, everything is so intricate and well thought out and philosophical, and that's just my bread and butter. Can't get enough of this record, and if I go back to a Contortionist record, chances are, if it's going to be this or Language, it's going to be this. Next up, Violator by Depeche Mode. The reason this record means so much to me is it was one of the first records I ever owned on CD and ever spun on a stereo system. I had this little like portable CD player with like shitty headphones, and I would just bring it everywhere, and Violator was one of the first records that I really got into, and something about the instrumentation and the electronics of it and how vintage it sounds. Depeche Mode are probably like my favorite electronic band, and there's a good reason for that. I love this record. I think it's fantastically made, and I don't think you could ask for more from a record like this from the 80s or 90s. And even now, a lot of their ideas to me just come across as like ingenious for the time. Next up, Caustic by Primitive Man. One of the most crushing, debilitating, hopeless records that you will ever hear in your life. And without failure, if I am feeling like low manic, or if I am just feeling completely destroyed or whatever, this record helps. It embodies those emotions perfectly, and nothing even comes close to representing or replicating how my emotions feel quite like Caustic. I have praised this record to the like fifth dimension and back, and I will continue to do so because nothing embodies how I feel when I'm in that mindset more than that. If someone wants to know how I feel when I'm in that mindset, listen to Caustic by Primitive Man. Next up, Sophie with Oil of Every Pearls on Insides. Unfortunately, rest in peace to Sophie. I'm not going to go into much about this record, because this record is a very personal one to me, but It's Okay to Cry is within my top 10, if not top 5 songs ever written. That's all I need to say. Next up, New Beginning by Tracy Chapman. I love her as a lyricist. She's probably my favorite folk artist. I am someone that loves poeticism and lyricism, and this record is so minimalistic, and I think this record just gets swept under the rug in terms of Tracy Chapman's discography compared to like more popular songs and records from her, like Fast Car and stuff like that. But she is just a beautiful vocalist, and she shows that you can do so much with so little. Genuinely one of the most beautiful records I've ever heard, and every time I listen to it, it just makes me feel so much despair, both for the world, but what we create of it. You don't need to scream, you don't need to be powerful, you can just be minimalistic and get your point across perfectly. Next up, Dear Agony by Breaking Benjamin. Dear Agony, specifically this record, is the one that got me into Breaking Benjamin, but one of my very first close friends, just in general, got me into Breaking Benjamin, and I thank them a lot. Just Breaking Benjamin as a band have been one of the most influential ones to me vocally. Benjamin Burnley is a fantastic vocalist, and even though I know they make the same record a lot, I will always eat it up, because they got me very much into like the post-grunge and hard rock movement, and I grew up with a lot of those bands like in the post-grunge and alternative rock genres, and Breaking Benjamin have always stood out as one of my favorites. And records like Dark Before Dawn and Ember and Dear Agony, Phobia, Saturate, We Are Not Alone, I will always adore Breaking Benjamin. Every track is so catchy, they have the riffs, they have the choruses, I love it. Next up, Treehouse by Icy Stars. I'm not usually like an electronicore type of person, and I don't really like their early material that is super electronicore based, but this record is just beautiful. It's atmospheric, it's lyrically poignant, and I love the vocals, I love the production, I love the synths, and it continues to be one of my favorite releases to come out of the Sumerian Records camp. Eclipse by Veil of Maya is my favorite deathcore record, and I will fight anyone on that. It may not be the most conventional deathcore record, but it is my favorite, and as soon as I heard this thing, it changed how I saw deathcore, because it showed me that at the time you could do so much with it, and so many bands were not doing much with it, and contemporarily the only ones that were was maybe like Born of Osiris. Like both were kind of like they were going to be progressive metalcore bands, but they were deathcore bands, but they had the influence coming from like progressive metal. And God, the concept of Eclipse, the lyrics, the tongue-in-cheek shit on like Punisher, I love Eclipse, and it's a record that's in and out quick, so if you don't like it, you can just leave or be done with it, and you don't really have to waste too much time on it if you don't like it, but please give it a try. Flamboyant by Dorian Electra, another record that is super important to me, lyrically, conceptually, vocally. I think Dorian Electra is a charismatic, fantastic performer, and their music just continues to impress me every time they release something, and I cannot express how much this record meant to me when it came out, because I was like, shit. Ride the Lightning by Metallica, my favorite Metallica record, and the one that really got me into them. It wasn't Master of Puppets, it wasn't Kill 'Em All, it wasn't like the Black Album even. I love the Black Album, and those have a lot of tracks that like do mean a lot to me, especially on the Black Album, but Ride the Lightning, I will never recreate the first time that I heard For Whom the Bell Tolls, and what that did for me on so many levels as a metalhead and as a rock fan. It just sent me on a trip that I am so glad it did, and I think that this is Metallica's best record. It was in my Metallica tier list at like number 1 for a reason. Next up, The Wall by Pink Floyd. Some of my favorite songs ever written. Conceptually, vocally, production-wise, how the fuck do you not like The Wall by Pink Floyd? I can't believe Nostalgia Critic did what he did, but that's besides the point. I think some Pink Floyd records are very overrated, and unfortunately, I will say that The Wall is a very safe pick in Pink Floyd's discography, but don't worry, I genuinely speaking do like other things like, you know, Atom Heart Mother and Animals, but The Wall just as a record meant so much to me growing up, because it felt like something, it felt like a movie, and it felt like a theatrical cinematic thing. It didn't just feel like an album, it felt like more than that. It felt like a whole story was being played out in front of me, and no one will ever do it like Pink Floyd. And then I have my 2 favorite records from my favorite artist and my favorite band. So we'll do the band first. I was stuck between Augment and Drift, but I'm gonna go with Drift by Era. I can't even begin to describe what, like, Era means to me as a band. They are my favorite metal band, and Drift, I have so many memories with this record. I've shared so many times in my life with this record, and I adore Sumerian Records, and when I heard Drift, funnily enough, I didn't actually hear of this record. What happened is I used to go to FYE a lot, which is like, if you're not from America or you maybe don't have one near you, it's like a record and memorabilia merchandise store. Unfortunately, the one near me closed. I used to go there, and they had a pretty good metal section, and I had this habit of sometimes, if I wanted to splurge, I would literally just look for a record and just get it. And I was actually there for the Bring Me the Horizon record, There's a Hell, Believe Me, I've Seen It, There's a Heaven, Let's Keep It a Secret. And there was this really pretty record at the bottom of the shelf. There was one copy, and it was Drift by Era. And I looked on the back, and I just thought the artwork looked fucking beautiful. And it said Sumerian Records on it. And up until that point, I loved bands on Sumerian Records like Asking Alexandria, Born of Osiris, Veil of Maya, I See Stars. And so I was like, well, I need to check this out. I didn't actually end up getting it. I went home, and when I listened to it, I was like, I have to get that. And I ended up going back to get that last record, the last copy. And ever since then, I was really close to putting Augment here because Augment also meant a lot to me at the time. But this record got me through so much shit. And if you want to talk about getting through so much shit, I'll get to the next record in a moment, which is just my favorite record. Man, atmospherically, production-wise, vocally, lyrically, I think that this is just like the perfect gent and progressive metalcore record, and obviously I'm biased. That's why I don't really want to remake my Era tier list, is because I just don't think Era has a bad record, but I know that's my bias. And then finally, my favorite record from a non-metal artist, like a solo artist. I already talked about him with the Void Eternal review, and I already talked about how he is my favorite artist in my How Music Saves Lives video, Nothing Nowhere with Ruiner. I almost put Reaper here, but Ruiner by Nothing Nowhere is one of the only records that I can just spin indefinitely, back to back, every day, every week, and it means something different to me at that time. This record has been there for me through friend group drama, through breakups, through depression, through anxiety, through crises, and no matter what was happening in my life, Nothing Nowhere as an artist was always the one that I turned to. Just in every sense of the word. It's very simple. It's a very straight to the point record, but every time I go back to it, it means the world to me. And even though I don't listen to it as much as I once did, this record will always leave an imprint on me just as a person, and I love it very much. But what are your favorite records? What mean the most to you, emotionally, vocally, lyrically, whatever it may be, production-wise, cover art, lyrics, I don't know. Whatever you want to do, it's literally up to you. No stipulations. And don't feel like you gotta prove yourself to me or anyone else. Like, I'm not gonna judge you. I have some very, like, questionable picks on this list that people are probably gonna get upset about because it's hated bands or whatever. I don't believe in guilty pleasures. I believe in liking what you like, but that's just me. Ain't none of my business. Speaking of that, what were your thoughts of my list? Are there any records here you really like or really don't like? Let me know down in the comment section below. I can't wait to hear your guys' opinions on it. Otherwise, be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is. My name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.